Okay, well, let's do this again. Now we're doing a lecture on St. Thomas Aquinas. And though I'm recording this on Thursday night, of course, you don't have to listen to it until tomorrow, Friday the 27th. But if you want to get a head start, that's fine. This should be done by 10. And some of you are night owls and stay up late. And I bet at least one of you will be playing this after midnight, right? So let's go ahead and dive right in. So we are fast forwarding. Let's see here. Look at this, into the 13th century. So Augustine dies in the 5th century BC, AD, excuse me, AD, Anno Domini is what that means, the year of the Lord. People try to use a more neutral designation for that epoch that we happen to inhabit with CE, the Common Era, but they still date it back to the date or the putative, the supposed birth year of Jesus. And so since everyone agrees that that seems to be the critical year, I don't see the point of saying CE, Common Era, as if pretending that wasn't the crucial year for everyone. So I just stick with AD. That's what I grew up with, and so I'm an old man, guys. It's hard to change me. All right, so now we just fast forwarded, goodness, about 750 years, okay? So that means a lot has changed in the meantime. And to summarize what has changed would be effectively impossible, right? But we can say that medieval Europe has come into existence. The Roman Empire, at least the Western Empire, has faded. The Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, contemporary Istanbul, right, persisted and would persist while gradually being whittled away and having chunks taken out of it until 1453, when the Turks, the people who inhabit Turkey today and are descendants of these people, when the Turks finally defeat the Eastern Roman Empire and bring it to an end. Oh, by the way, the Russians think of themselves as a kind of third Rome and as carrying on the mission and the spirit, the historical destiny of the Eastern Roman Empire. Okay, it's good to know things like that when you start thinking geopolitically and how these great nations conceive of themselves, what their historical mission is, and how they then might act on the historical stage. Right. I'll just offer a footnote to you. I spoke to several military people over the summer, and they told me that Russia effectively is a contained problem. The top brass and the DoD are not talking about it anymore as like a major problem. They're concerned more about China. I don't buy it, because when you listen to the Russians talk on their, like, they have the equivalent of a Fox News over there. They describe our leadership in no uncertain terms as Antichrist. That's the vocabulary they use, and that they are involved in a struggle for their existence. And if they don't win the conflict with the West, because they think of the conflict in Ukraine, it's not the Ukraine, by the way, the conflict in Ukraine as a proxy war between Russia and NATO and the United States. And if they don't win, and somehow if they don't ultimately succeed in containing NATO and the United States, that could mean the end of them as a nation. Well, if that's how they're thinking, anything can happen, guys. So I'm not convinced that that's a contained problem. All right, but why not make these historical points? Link it back, okay? St. Thomas Aquinas inherited a condition effectively created by Charlemagne, right? In the year 800, he was crowned by the Pope in Rome and made. Now, at that time, they didn't designate him Holy Roman Emperor, but subsequent generations, I think in the mid 950s, they began talking about, his successors began talking about themselves as the Holy Roman Emperor, right? Now, not just the Roman Emperor, but the Holy Roman Emperor, a kind of resuscitation or even resurrection of Christian Rome. Christian Rome came into existence, well, I guess over the course of the 4th century. Christianity was protected by the law, or by decree of Constantine, really, in 313 AD, and then in 2 separate years, Theodosius, in 381 and 390, Theodosius in 2 strokes outlawed all pagan religions, and that more or less established Rome as a Christian empire, which is a rather stunning historical development, given that the Romans had killed anywhere from 200,000 to 300,000 Christians up until the year 313, right? Then somehow they took over, and that some historians say that the empire only lasted as long as it did, on account of there having been so many Christian communities that kept it together. That's a debate the historians have. I'll leave that to them. And the Western Empire, as we said, gradually petered out, and then made something like a comeback under Charlemagne. He did conquer a good deal of territory, basically in Central Europe and France. Well, Western Europe, pardon me, not Central Europe, Western Europe. I'm picturing it in my head, heading down to the Italian peninsula. And that establishes a new political and spiritual reality, which would persist, some say, until 1806, with the formal abolition of the Holy Roman Empire by Napoleon Bonaparte. But truth be told, there will be a Holy Roman Emperor until 1926, when the Blessed Karl of Austria is deposed. And he made, I think, 2 or 3 attempts at returning to Austria and placing himself back on the throne. Those didn't work, and since then there has been no Holy Roman Emperor. Okay? So now let's put ourselves in the middle of all this. We're in the 13th century. The 13th century is the height of the High Middle Ages. Okay? This is Western Europe at its height of power. When you consider what happened, let's say, from the 600s forward, the great Muslim invaders succeeded in taking major portions of the Middle East. They, what today we call the Middle East, they didn't call it that back then. They took territory from Byzantine, which nonetheless held out, but also took all of North Africa. And so the ancient Mediterranean world that we presupposed at the beginning of the course in discussing Hellenic philosophy, this has been severed into 2 pieces. And so there is the northern half of the Mediterranean, right? And Thomas Aquinas is an Italian, right? So from the northern half of the Mediterranean, and that's Christian, and at this point in history is Catholic. There's no difference between those 2 things, right? At this point in history. Well, I shouldn't say that, because the Eastern Empire has separated from the Catholic Church, and we can just call them the Orthodox Church, just to have a word. They call themselves that. Okay, so the northern Mediterranean was Christian and Catholic, and the southern Mediterranean territories in North Africa had become Muslim, with a few holdout Christian minorities and some Jews. Okay, and there were Jews on the European continent as well, not in very great numbers. All right. So what happens is by the 13th century, actually by the late 11th century, and through the 12th and the 13th centuries, we witness a series of crusades. So Western Europe begins pushing back. Well, how could they do that? Because they had become an economic success, right? And so Aquinas is born into this flourishing civilization. I mean, today we think of the Middle Ages as some kind of backwards period where people were pulling one another around on ox carts, and their faces were muddy, and women had straggly hair, and the men were all missing teeth. And, it wasn't really that bad. I guess in some parts, but it was a progressive time. It witnessed the rebirth of philosophy. There were technological advancements, and science was doing well. I mean, the idea that the medieval period was bereft of science and scientific experimentation. That's just a modern myth that has no basis in reality. And if you look at, I'll just give you a couple of names here. You want to look up Francis Bacon. That's one figure. Or, not Francis Bacon. We'll get to him later. Roger Bacon. That's what I meant. You want to look up Roger Bacon. So he was certainly a scientist, no doubt of that. And then Albertus Magnus. That means Albert the Great. We just call him, the Great. Albertus Magnus. He'd be a second. And then I guess a third figure who sort of spans the he spans the distance, or kind of tries to find some kind of link between philosophy, theology, and even something sort of like magic or something of that sort. That would be Raymond Lull, or Ramon Lull, L-L-U-L-L. But he would engage in scientific investigations as well. And you go back, historically, you find that there isn't much of a distinction for a very long period of time, at least in practice, much of a distinction between science on the one hand and magic on the other. That distinction ends up being enforced, developed and enforced in the 17th century. And even at that time, the greatest scientist of the 17th century, Sir Isaac Newton, was an alchemist, folks. He spent most of his time practicing alchemy, which is closely related to magic. Okay, so St. Thomas Aquinas had no interest in magic whatsoever. He was an individual who devoted himself wholly to two things, philosophy and theology. And his vision was such that he thought that a university teacher, which he became, is an individual who should master both of those disciplines. Right now we have the philosophy departments, and here or there we have a theology department at Christian colleges, right? Aquinas would have said that's a mistake. We're supposed to have persons who are thoroughly educated. He would say in Aristotelian science. All the study of Aristotle you've done so far will pay dividends when you turn to Aquinas. We should have persons who are thoroughly grounded in Aristotelian science and the study of nature, right? And these very same persons should then study revealed science and the domain of grace. Okay, so we have the study of nature with the assistance of the Aristotelian texts. And Aquinas is with Aristotle about 92% of the time or so. And then there is the domain of grace, which is revealed to us through the grace of God, through specific acts through which God illuminates the human mind, or has illuminated the human mind, and continues to do so within the context of his mystical body, the Church, of which St. Thomas Aquinas was a member. Okay, so as I said, let's get into the actual typed lecture here, because there are points I wanted to make. He was born into a time in which the philosophy of Aristotle had been recovered in its entirety. Because prior to Thomas's time, by the way, philosophers and theologians just call him Thomas. Prior to Thomas's time, there was a kind of a gradual recovery of the Aristotelian texts. If you go back to the 11th century, we had hardly any of them. I believe we had the categories, right? Maybe some parts of his logic. The categories would be part of that. Some parts of what we call the organon. I mentioned that earlier in connection with Aristotle. And these texts, they were recovered through translations from the Greek, carried out in two places. In Sicily, right? The origin, famed origin of the Italian mafia. It's also a place of a great translation site. And another chunk of the Aristotelian corpus was translated from Arabic. So it had been translated from Greek into Arabic, and from Arabic into Latin in Toledo. And we might remind ourselves that Aquinas and all of the philosophers and theologians of his time were writing and thinking in Latin, and even speaking in Latin at the university. Okay? Latin was the lingua franca of that time, as English is today. So, following the footsteps of his teacher, Albertus Magnus, Aquinas worked out a reconciliation of faith and reason that has proved to be more or less dominant in the Catholic Church for centuries, though some scholars of the Catholic intellectual tradition emphasize that his Franciscan successor, Blessed Duns Scotus, was also a dominant influence, and Scotus certainly scores a few points. Let's grant him that. Okay, evidence of this last claim lies in the fact that the canons and decrees of the Council of Trent and the resulting catechism of the Council of Trent were carefully worded so as to remain entirely neutral between Thomism and Scotism. There is a professor who's argued this. His name is Professor Goff. It's not important that you know his name. He argues that Pope Leo XIII promoted Aquinas over Scotus simply because the former's reasoning and mode of presentation was far more accessible. Well, maybe Aquinas is the superior philosopher, but I'm not going to argue that one way or another right now. So Aquinas was a specific type of priest. He was a Dominican friar, okay? And so we should talk about the Dominicans. So the Dominicans, they were founded by none other than Saint Dominic, okay? They emerged to combat the Albigensian, that is Cathar. There was I'm trying to explain this. There was a castle in southern France, in Provence, the castle of Albigenses, right? And then this castle was kind of a center for this religious movement and this kind of religious energy that was emanating from it, and gradually moving through and ultimately taking over the entire province of Provence, which today is a big vacation territory. They also produce halfway decent wine, and there's ochre down there that they sell. It's also called Cathar. The Albigensian movement was also called the Cathars. They call themselves the Cathars. That means pure. And when you look at their actual doctrine, they're just another version of the Gnostic heresy. Now, what does Gnosticism teach? Gnosticism teaches that there is a basic distinction between good and evil. Okay? And there's a good God and there's a bad God. And the bad God has just as much right to exist as the good God. Now, the good God might win in the end, but it doesn't mean the bad God is cast forever into a fiery pit or something of that sort. He continues doing his thing, right? Your interest, of course, is in aligning yourself with the good God. And you can do that by effectively ignoring the needs of the body and paying attention to your soul, which is effectively a dollop of light, so to speak, that's trapped in your body. And if you can emancipate that dollop of light and send it shooting upwards to the Empyrean realm, as it were, you will rejoin the divine and enjoy bliss. Another aspect of the Gnostic heresy is that really moral conduct is not central. What's important is knowledge. And if you can acquire certain knowledge through study and ultimately initiation, you need to be initiated by persons who are ahead of you in the hierarchy, then the possession of that knowledge itself saves, as it were, right? So St. Dominic ended up visiting an inn, staying at an inn, having a conversation with a Cathar. I think, according to legend, it was a 15-hour conversation on and off, and he managed to convert the man. And he wasn't yet the founder of the Dominicans. That conversation which supposedly prompted him to do so, to found the Dominican order. And this was your first, as it were, mendicant, that means impoverished and begging order that was in the world. So they would walk about talking to people. They didn't just cloister themselves and pray, which, I mean, he had a perfectly robust and healthy respect for cloistered monks and nuns, but he perceived a need for a new type of activity. And so St. Dominic founded this new order that would actually take the doctrine of the church directly to the people. So that's the context. So let's see here. Now, when the Dominicans, now look at that, there's a typo there. I have the Domicans. When the Let's see, and now the caps are on there. That's right. That's not good. So when the Dominicans' methods of reasoning and preaching failed, right? Yeah, I skipped some points there. Pardon me. So the Cathars, they taught that marriage and engendering children is evil. That's interesting because the body's no good, right? So you shouldn't engender children. But they also, um, I guess, they were kind of schizophrenic. They promoted free love. So you shouldn't have kids, but you basically generate them through free love. They must have been pro-choice or something. Otherwise, that's not gonna add up. So when the Dominicans' methods of reasoning and preaching failed, the church launched what is today called the Albigensian Crusade. Okay, so there was a military campaign they sent down to the south to stamp out the heresy. You can think of that any way you like. The important lesson to draw from this for an understanding of Aquinas is that he understood himself as having joined a preaching order. That's the important part. One particularly charged with spreading the word to infidels, non-believers, and even active opponents of Christianity, mainly Muslims and Jews. So Dominic's vision was not the vision of the sword. It was the vision of basically my slides in the first part of the course. You sit down with people and your reason matters out, and people end up where they end up. So other persons took a different view, and they ended up launching that crusade. Um, you got to look at things from the point of view of people back then, right? So that they would have assumed that this Cathar heresy was effectively leading to uh, the ultimate damnation of thousands of persons and their loss to very considerable eternal misery, right? That's what they believe, so that's how they would justify a crusade. All right, so we may understand his use of reason as put in service of faith. Okay, faith is at once, for Aquinas, an assent of the intellect to those truths that cannot be proved by reason, right? That God is a holy trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right? You can't prove that by reason. You might say it makes a little sense once you think about it, but you can't prove it, not deductively at least, right? Um, Christ has two wills and two natures, divine and human, so on and so forth. These things are um, doctrines of faith. The ocean of divine mercy is infinite. God could forgive even Stalin if he would repent. You know, that sort of thing. These are all articles of faith. And his faith is not really an assent, it's a submission of the human intellect to the divine intellect. So he's presupposing that's all the background of Aquinas. So it is worth emphasizing that medieval society, and Aquinas in particular, really had no conception of a leap of faith. So if we approach St. Thomas Aquinas and medieval philosophy, now we call this scholastic philosophy. Scholastic philosophy. If we approach this with certain modern prejudices, we end up missing what they're doing. If you confronted St. Thomas Aquinas and said, "Well, your faith is based just on a leap in the dark," he would say, "No, no, not at all, not even close." Let me explain. Faith for the educated medieval believer was entirely reasonable. Okay, um, the difference between faith and reason was not one of opposition. It's not like, once you leave the domain of reason, you enter into irrationality. There was no connection between faith and irrationality for the medieval mind. Okay, it was a relationship of subordination and integration. So it'll take some effort for us to actually understand that because we've been habituated from our earliest years as part of we took it in with our mother's milk, right? That there's reason on the one hand, and that's the responsible thing that scientists do. And then there's faith on the other, and that's just some kind of arbitrary leap in the dark. And if you want to believe in Jesus, you're free to do so because of the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States of America. But don't you dare compare that to the sober and responsible and trustworthy methods of science, right? That's simply not how the medievals looked at it. So let's try to dig into this a bit so we can appreciate how they thought. So reason, oh, I lost my lecture, guys. Let me see here. Hold on, I gotta fix this, otherwise I can't talk. There we go. Reason was understood as the faculty of demonstrative knowledge, right? So we talked about that at the beginning of the course, whereby proceeding from statements known to be true without recourse to Christian tradition, one validly deduces conclusions that, as demonstrated, can be known to be true. Basically, you depend upon the unassisted human intellect to lay down premises that can be picked up ultimately through sense perception, okay? You relate them to one another and draw the consequences from them. And we did some of that in our study of Aristotle. And we saw that some of that was in Aristotle was something like just penetrating insight, like his definition of motion or change. That wasn't deduced. He just laid that out. Faith was understood as presupposing the traditions of the church. Okay, so tradition is going to figure in here, and tradition is going to include testimony. And if we have testimony, we have evidence. You guys see how this is not simply a leap, when you start talking about evidence. Okay, so they would say this, we have at least 150 and upwards of 300 prophetic texts in the Old Testament concerning Jesus Christ. I'll give you some of the big ones, Isaiah 53:6, Daniel 7:13, 9:24 through 27. These would have been on the minds of a person like St. Thomas Aquinas. Probably had the Bible memorized. They would have, said something like, "Well, you have these all these prophecies that actually were fulfilled, and the chance of that happening, by the chance of that happening arbitrarily is so vanishingly remote. We have to effectively understand that these prophecies were genuinely fulfilled." Right? That's how they would argue. And then there was the eyewitness testimony of Jesus' miracles and innumerable subsequent miracles associated with the saints. And I bet a couple of you think you have a family member or you know someone who was healed miraculously through prayer. My wife's uncle had 4th stage cancer, and they took him to a shrine down in Peru in a place called Otusco. And they dressed him up in rags and chains and had him kind of struggle his way to the shrine. And lo and behold, the cancer went away. And you can assess that any way you like. But the medievals believed that there were miracles, and these were confirmatory, right? Okay. And then we should mention within the tradition, there were the 7 great church councils, the writings of the fathers of the church, various papal acts and publications and decretals, and even private revelations to specific saints. So this is a very complex tradition, which is basically here impossible to do justice to or summarize. And Aquinas is in the middle of this whole, as it were, organism of Catholic Europe, which he was trying to serve in some way. I mean, so let's see here. Try to fix this. I got to get that in the right spot. There we go. So faith in the main involved the particular details, and they would say credible testimony concerning the same of the historical tradition of the relation between God and humanity, specifically his people from Abraham through Israel, Jacob Israel, right, to the perfection of this tradition. And they would say the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, its doctrines, canons, liturgy, sacraments, hierarchy, and authority. Okay, so faith in this context, is a gift of grace that no one can gain through his own effort, but which is freely dispensed at the asking. So it's a complicated doctrine of faith. It presupposes, as it were, historical proofs for the authenticity of the claims of the Catholic Church. And these historical proofs, right, are then, as it were, brought to life and supplemented through a divine gift, through which there is that assent to things which cannot be demonstrated by unassisted reason, and the submission of the intellect to the divine intellect that we referred to above. And in the mind of Aquinas and his contemporaries, that act of faith does not oppose to reason, it perfects it. It presupposes, takes up everything that one learns, let's say through the sciences, because they understood themselves as pursuing sciences, takes up the sciences and, as it were, baptizes them and even empowers them and perfects them in a context in which further truths are added, which enable one to see and penetrate through to the very essence of reality. And that can only be done adequately and fully in heaven, of course, where one enjoys the vision of God. Okay, so hopefully that makes some sense to you and gives you a kind of picture and a flavor of how Aquinas thinks about these things. All right, so Aquinas taught that one can prove the existence of God from reason alone. Okay, so now we're going to not utilize the gift of faith. You follow that? This is an interesting thing for Aquinas to do. We saw in Augustine didn't really bother trying to distinguish when he was using faith and when he was using reason. As a matter of fact, when he was reasoning, he was praying, right? At least intermittently. And so his reasoning itself was, as it were, interwoven with faith. And he might have said that some of the premises he got were inspired. I mean, if we pressed about it, who knows? He's not here. I can't ask him. So there we are. So Aquinas is doing something very specific methodologically here. He's how to put it? He's suspending for the moment. He's bracketing the gift of faith and relying simply on the power of reason, just as Aristotle and Epicurus and the Stoics relied simply on the power of reason. Okay? And he did this deliberately as an act. This is the curious part. He did this deliberately as an act of charity because he wanted to develop a series of arguments that he could bring to persons outside of the community of faith, so as to persuade them that God indeed exists. And he's so ambitious in this. He thinks he can prove not only that God exists, but that God is self-giving love. Interesting, right? He can get that from reason without yet turning to the Bible. Because if he can get people that far, I think in his way his mind works or worked, if you can get people that far, then you're preparing them, right, for that next step of accepting the actual faith. I mean, if God's love, then then suddenly Christianity makes more sense, right? That seems to be his strategy. Now, in a philosophy course, what we do is we focus on the actual arguments he brings forward for the existence of God. Okay? And these arguments are 5 in number, and they're called the 5 ways. A way is a path, right? A 5 path to prove or demonstrate the existence of God. Proof and demonstration in this context have no distinction. So his proofs have 2 characteristics. Well, they're deductive. We're familiar with what deductive logic is. But they're also a posteriori. They begin with premises. A posteriori, we got that in the slides too. That refers to a matter of contingent fact. Okay? And the a posteriori premises he uses characterize each of the 5 ways in succession. So let's look at those a posteriori premises. Okay? So I'm not certain I'll be able to finish this lecture today, but that's okay. Number 1, things move. Okay? It needn't be the case that things move. It could be the case that there was simply one eternal being who didn't create anything, right? So the fact things move, that's contingent and a posteriori. 6.2, there are natural and artificial causes, and there are natural and artificial effects. That's also contingent for the same reasons. 6.3, the cosmos exists, okay? That's a matter of contingency. 6.4, there is truth, goodness, and beauty in gradations. Let's put it this way. We could imagine all these things not pertaining, right? We could imagine these things not existing. If it's conceivable that all these statements be false, they're a posteriori. All right, so yep, there's truth, goodness, and beauty in gradations. And 6.5, the cosmos exhibits extraordinary order and purpose. So let's look at the first way here. First way is premise number 1, beings move. Okay? Premise number 2, if a being is actually in motion, then either A, it was induced into actual motion from potential motion, right? Because a thing is going to make that transition to actual motion from potential motion. So either it was induced into actual motion from potential motion by a distinct being that is in act, right, with respect to motion or simply with respect to its being, by a distinct being that is in act at the time of the induction into motion, or else it induced itself to move. Now here's the question, can anything induce itself to move? And premise number 3 says no, nothing can induce itself to move, so you have to be careful. Therefore, all beings in motion have been induced to move by a distinct being that is in act at the time of the induction. Okay? All right, so something's caused to move is caused by something else. Put it in plain English. Premise 4. If one being in act induces motion in another being, then it is either itself in motion or simply in the act of being. Okay, something that is in motion is, as it were, traversing a path towards an end, and something in the act of being is simply in its end. Okay? If it is in motion, then it requires a prior being or mover that is itself in motion, or simply itself in the act of being. Now, if the sequence of prior beings or movers regresses infinitely or without limit, then in that series there is no single being that is, here's the key term here, sufficient, right, to cause motion in any of the subsequent beings in the series, and therefore the series itself would not exist. Okay? But there is in fact a series of beings in motion induced to move by prior beings and movers, and therefore conclusion number 2, there is a first being in pure act of being. Say it again, there's a first being in pure act of being functioning as a first unmoved mover of all beings in the act of motion. Okay, can't have an infinite regress, otherwise nothing in the series would suffice to account for all the subsequent things that have been moved. All right. And I have a comment here on infinite series. You know, we covered this in the lecture on Augustine, so I'll skip it. We have an infinite series. Well, what would explain the existence of the infinite series? Right? Apparently can't explain its own existence because it does not exist all at once, right? And since it doesn't contain its existence in itself, it's possible for it not to exist. What caused it to exist? It has to be something outside of that that infinite series, right? And that would be, as it were, the cause of the existence of that series. So one way or another, right? There's a cause. Either there's a first cause of the series, or there's something outside of the series entirely that causes it. All right. So now the second way. This concerns the concept of cause and effect. So there are causes and effects. Let's grant that. If there is no first cause, then there is nothing sufficient of itself to bring about the subsequent effects. If there is nothing sufficient of itself to bring about the subsequent effects, then there are no intermediate causes or effects. But there are intermediate causes or effects, and therefore there is a first sufficient cause, or there's a first cause sufficient to bring about subsequent effects. So a lot of this has to do with sufficiency, what suffices, what reaches the threshold, right, of adequate causation, such as to account for the being of something. And if you're educated in physics, don't think about these causal relationships in terms of billiard balls bouncing off one another. He's Aristotelian, so he's thinking more in terms of individuals existing. So what causes an individual to exist? Well, its parents caused it to exist, right? What caused them to exist? Well, their respective parents, the grandparents. Okay, very good. What causes the whole thing? Well, you can say, well, the surrounding ecological context and even the cosmic context, including the sun, and we know the moon's important. And I don't think they weren't sophisticated back then. They understood the importance of tides, and I can't tell you whether or not they had the insight that the moon. Well, how could they not? You know, they observed these things very carefully, so they must have understood the moon had some kind of influence there, though they hadn't yet formulated Newton's theory of gravitation. I'm curious about that. I'll have to look that up about medieval theories about the moon and the tides and so on and so forth. They would have understood. Now, here's an element of medieval doctrine which would depart from today's doctrine, but that the crystalline spheres I mentioned in connection with Aristotle played a regulatory role in the entire order of the cosmos, right? And that all these things kind of interacted in a way to produce this cosmic order and sustain the biosphere in which we're living right now, right? So they'd have this kind of large-scale account of how all that holds together, but none of that would work unless they were a first unmoved mover that was itself inducing motion in everything else. And there can't be something that moves the unmoved mover by definition, but it has to be unmoved. There has to be an unmoved mover, because that is what alone would satisfy the need for a sufficient, a necessary, of course, a necessary and sufficient condition for the movement of everything else. Okay, leave it that way. The third way. So let's assume everything is contingent, okay? So we'll try this first premise. If the past is finite and nothing comes to be from nothing, then the universe has a cause outside of itself, okay? So let's grant that, but then we'll consider the possibility that time is infinite. So premise number 2. To be contingent means for it to be possible to be and possible not to be. That's what it means for something to be contingent. It's an implication of the idea of contingency. That means something is dependent upon something else having happened, and had that other thing not happened, it wouldn't be. So it's possible for it to have happened because the condition for its happening is possible to it's possible for that condition to obtain, but it's also possible for the contingent being not to exist because it's equally possible that the condition for its existence not obtain. Okay. All right. So for example, the existence of an avocado is contingent upon an avocado plant receiving nutriment, water, and sunlight. And after it comes to be, one may eat the avocado. Very good. If the past is infinite and its existence is contingent, right? So let's hold on for a second. Follow that. If the past is infinite, right, goes on forever, and its existence is contingent, then for the whole of the past, it was subject to the possibility of not being, right? Because the notion of contingency includes the concept of possible non-existence, all right? Okay, and then that characteristic of possibly not existing would have been true of every moment of an infinite past. So premise number 4, now do assume that all things are contingent. Conclusion, therefore the possibility of not being for the past will in fact, I have to say this again, the possibility of not being for the past will have been actualized at some time in the past, because in infinite past, let's put it this way, in any infinity, all actualities, all possibilities are actualized. Say it again. In an infinity, all possibilities are actualized. So if the possibility of not being resides in an infinite, for example, an infinite past, then that possibility would have been actualized. And so therefore, if that possibility had been actualized, the universe will not now exist. Premise 5, the universe does in fact now exist, okay? Okay, but since the conclusion is true and the argument is valid, I don't know why that's up there like that. Premise 5 is true. The universe does in fact now exist, and conclusion 2 and 5 are mutually contradictory. So conclusion 2 says the universe will not now exist, and premise 5, on the basis of observation now, states that the universe does exist. Okay, so we've deduced something from our assumption that everything is contingent. We've deduced something which contradicts observed fact. If everything is contingent and the past is infinite, then the universe would not now exist. But the universe does now exist. Now, some of you are thinking, well, let's just get rid of the assumption that the past is infinite, because if we get rid of that, then we get rid of the consequence that all possibilities have to be actualized. Well, that's fine. Let's make the universe limited in time. Well, then things become really easy for Aquinas, because in that case, there's a first moment in time, and nothing comes to be without being caused to be by brought into being by something distinct from itself. So there's a first cause in time. That cause would be outside of time, because if it were inside time, it couldn't cause time to exist. It would be coincident or contemporaneous with time. The first cause of the first moment in time would be outside of time, therefore atemporal. Therefore, it would exist all at once. All of its attributes and characteristics would be coincident with one another. It itself would be coincident with its own existence, so it would exist in virtue of itself, and therefore it would really be identical with its own being, and that is something which would necessarily exist, and that's what we would call God. Okay? So either way, either path, if the past is finite, we get to God. If the past is infinite, and we assume that there is no necessary being for the sake of argument, then we get to the conclusion that the universe does not exist, but it does exist. So that doesn't work either. So we have to deny the original assumption that all things are contingent. So we end up with the conclusion not all things are contingent, which is the same thing as to say there is at least one necessary being. Okay? All right. So now this is where we get to an interesting distinction, because this necessary being, it has being in some kind of superlative and unsurpassing way. And I try to capture this the following way. What it has is not merely necessary being, it has necessary hyphen being as a kind of mode of being. It has existence in such a way that it can't not exist, as opposed to contingent being. Like you and me, we have being in the mode of contingency and the mode of dependency, such that it is possible for us not to have been brought into existence. I mean, we have been, and at this moment it's possible for us not to exist. Okay. All right, let's see here. Now, Thomas earlier argued that even if God is identical with his own being, it does not follow that human beings have immediate, undemonstrated knowledge of this true statement. You guys follow? So he does believe God is identical with his own being. And some of you may be thinking to yourself, okay, since God is identical with his own being, why bother with all this argumentation? Just say, okay, he necessarily exists, because anything that is identical with its own being is. There's just one step to the conclusion. No, Aquinas says we can't assume that there is such a thing that is identical with its own being. That has to be demonstrated. We have to demonstrate that on the basis of observed reality. And this is the thing about Aquinas. He is very, the basic premise of Thomism is that we are in contact with being. That's the basic premise of Thomism. Everywhere you look, there are things, and we make judgments about them. And the judgments can be true or false, but we can only distinguish between true and false judgments if we're actually in contact with the beings, so that we can make those discriminations, right? There's a pink elephant standing next to you. Well, look, that's false, right? How do you know that's false? Well, because you have access to reality, and you can then make a comparison, as it were, between your apprehension of reality, or what it is you do apprehend, right, and your judgment. There's a pink elephant standing next to you. Just make that your judgment for a moment, and you see that it's false, because there is no pink elephant there, right? Okay. So So there is a difference here. God is his being. There is nothing in reality that connects God with his being. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped a statement. Now, by analogy in mathematics, the Pythagorean theorem, that's also a necessary truth, was not known by anyone until it was demonstrated to be true, right? So there are necessary truths which need demonstration nonetheless, right? And that's true of the entire domain of mathematics. All sorts of necessary connections. You don't know them until you demonstrate them. Now, here's the point. Here's the difference between mathematics and theology. By the way, this is what you call natural theology, theology based on natural reason alone. So, God is his being. There is nothing in reality that connects God with his being. Whereas a squared plus b squared is connected to c squared via the more basic properties of a triangle, being three-sided, being a closed figure, each side being rectilinear, okay? So there is, as it were, a kind of mediation between a squared plus b squared and then the reality of c squared, those various quantities. And it's the triangle, the very essence of the triangle, which establishes that connection. Okay. Whereas with God, nothing establishes the connection between God and being. God is being. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Nothing in the order of human knowledge, I'm sorry. Nonetheless, in the order of human knowledge, we must rely upon mediating concepts that do not mediate the relation between God and being in reality. Does that make sense? So in geometry, the essence of the triangle mediates between a squared plus b squared on the one hand and c squared on the other. In metaphysics, God and being are immediately identical, but we only know that by introducing concepts that enable us to connect those two distinct concepts, the concept of God, the concept of being. Does this make any sense? Yeah, it's not that difficult. You have the concept of God, and you have the concept of being. And the fact that these are two distinct concepts, folks, well, it's obvious because one has one sound and the other one has a different sound, right? And it's not obvious to people that these are the same thing. It's through argumentation that we arrive at the conclusion that God is being. For example, from the assumption that everything is contingent. From that assumption, we demonstrated that there has to be at least one necessary being, and it has necessary being, necessary hyphen being, right? It is being, right? So we got there on the basis of the consideration of other propositions. Okay, hopefully that helps. So the basic mediating concepts for connecting God to being, and other attributes, by the way, are the basic premises of the five ways. Things move, there are causes and effects, so on and so forth. But also the additional premises that enter into each argument respectively. For example, in an infinite time, all possibilities are actualized, right? Okay. The fourth way. Truth, goodness, and beauty are present in gradations of perfection. For example, a tree is more or less a true specimen of treeness. Treeness is a universal pattern that's realized in multiple instantiations of trees. So a tree is more or less a true specimen of treeness. Now, a dying tree is less a true specimen of treeness, but a flourishing tree is more a true specimen of treeness. A human being is more or less morally good, and a work of art is more or less beautiful, right? So to get back to that first premise, truth, goodness, and beauty are present in gradations of perfection. So I try to illustrate that for you. Premise number two, where there are gradations of perfection, there must be a standard of perfection by which the imperfect is measured such that it is imperfect. It's kind of hard to do an end run around this, right? I mean, so if there are degrees of perfection, and it seems that there are, because we just gave ourselves several examples there in the realm of truth, goodness, and beauty, then there has to be a standard, right? Don't strain over this. I mean, it's just kind of, an obvious inference to draw. Okay, so if we are distinguishing between perfect, like, what would a perfect truck driver be? Someone who, changes lanes perfectly, looks down, 3/4 of a mile down the road the way he's supposed to do, assessing the situation as best he can. When he goes in reverse, he backs the trailer into the parking spot, into the lane in one shot. Very, very, very few truck drivers can do that. I'd say 1 out of every 50 or something like that. He'd be perfect, right? And that would be the standard. So you can't talk about perfection without there being a standard of perfection. So that's that. So conclusion, there is a standard of perfect truth, goodness, beauty, and every other perfection. He says this we call God. Okay? He's just saying, okay, there has to be some standard. He didn't say now we're right into the letters of St. Paul. You have to believe all that. We're at the very beginning here. He's saying that we have all these reasons to believe that there is a first sufficient cause of all things that move, a first sufficient cause of all effects, right? There is a necessary being, and there is a standard of truth, goodness, beauty. And you might say, well, what if these are all different things? And he might say, yeah, what if they are? I'm not to the point where I proved that these are all the same thing yet, right? Okay. So again, Aquinas at this stage merely assumes that one and the same entity is the standard of all perfections. But this needs more argument. If you were to sit down with him and say, shouldn't you argue out that there's only one, there's one being that is the standard in all these different ways? He would say, yeah, of course I have to argue that out. But give me time. I have to proceed step by step. Okay. Fifth way, cosmological argument. Premise number 1. If many things that lack intelligence or do not exercise their intelligence to organize their own bodies from the ground up are seen to act for an end, then there is an intelligent designer that orders them towards their respective ends. Like, for example, we see animals proceeding from the unity of sperm and egg in the womb of the mammalian mother, and then it turns into a little cluster of eggs, and then it begins to we get stem cells and whatnot. Then they differentiate and articulate, and then it becomes it acquires phenotypic articulation, and then eventually turns into a baby koala bear, right? And the mother gives birth to the koala bear, probably a little litter. I don't know how many they gave birth to. Okay, so he says if you see something like that, there's an intelligent designer. Now nowadays we say no. The whole thing's been programmed from the start. It's all a matter of the genetics. Now it turns out, like if you follow more advanced discussions in science, this whole idea of genetic determinism seems to have been discarded by the leaders in actual biology departments and research universities where they're cutting edge, right? So the old dream of working out a kind of deterministic step-by-step plan or account of the unfolding maturation of an organism with reference to a certain series of steps coded into DNA, that seems to be gone. And the idea of a one-to-one correspondence between aquiline nose and a certain DNA sequence and different sort of nose and a certain DNA sequence, that seems to be gone, despite what you're going to read in the paper about it. And further evidence that this old program has basically died is, the word hasn't gotten out on the street yet, right? Another indication is that these various medical companies where they've been sequencing or taking the human genome sequence and trying to develop, cutting edge medical technologies that will eliminate disease through editing one's genes, those haven't gone anywhere, and they've invested hundreds of millions of dollars into these things. They've made nothing because they can't heal anybody, and that would indicate that I think 123Me is one of these companies. That would seem to indicate that the basic premise upon which they have founded their operation is false. But take that with a grain of salt. I'm not a biology professor. I'm basically quoting other people, including we're talking about this about 20 years ago, guys. That deterministic thesis is gone. Anyway, it was gone 20 years ago. It's really gone now. Let's see. So I want to comment on this because this is interesting. The cosmological argument has been resuscitated in recent history. It can be shown mathematically that the probability of DNA forming from inorganic processes is so remote as in effect to be impossible. So you can't have life as we know it without DNA, right? You can't have life as we know it without DNA. Now, it turns out you don't need carbon. I think they found some exception to that. There's one type of entity appears to have all the attributes of life. By the way, there's a big debate concerning what life is. It seems to involve self-organization, self-defense, and self-replication. Okay, self-organization, self-defense, some kind of nutritive activity where it takes things in from the environment so as to nourish itself, sustain itself, self-maintenance, and self-reproduction. So self-organization, self-maintenance, self-defense, and reproduction. Okay, those four. But there's still a debate, so I'm not saying that is a final and definitive list of the attributes of life. They think they found something that is not that has those attributes, or attributes they accept at least, that that is not carbon based. I just leave it at that. So as far as we're concerned, right, everything which is alive has DNA. Okay, and DNA cannot have formed in the amount of time available to us in the cosmos we happen to be living in. All right. So by analogy, it is conceivable. I mean, it could have formed, but the chances are so remote you don't even take them seriously. So by analogy, it is conceivable that a tornado could construct a 767 by going through a junkyard, right? I mean, it's not impossible, right? But the probability is so low that we treat it as an in effect impossible. I call these quasi-impossibilities. Okay, please don't get dizzy. Use your common sense. Is a tornado ever going to go through a junkyard and construct a 767? Ever? It's never going to happen, even if the universe doesn't burn out. It's not going to happen. Okay, it's just don't get dizzy. Premise number one ought not to believe self-contradictory statements, an SCS, as they have a zero probability, right? That's true. Like, don't believe that Donald Trump is not Donald Trump. Okay, unless you're playing with words, but if you know, using those words at the same time and in the same respect, if you're using those words in the same respect, rather, I mean, that Donald Trump is actually not Donald Trump, and you're uttering gibberish. Okay, so if one ought not to believe self-contradictory statements, then one ought not to believe statements with a probability of truth so exceedingly low as to approximate to zero probability. For example, this 767 was constructed by a tornado. Okay, the chances of that, it's not too good to be true. It's just totally insane, right? Or DNA came to be through undirected pre-organic processes. Now, they studied that pretty carefully, and it's kind of granted. And people who look at this very carefully, they kind of scratch their head and say, you're right. This doesn't make any sense. They don't want to admit it. There's a famous biologist now named Brett Weinstein. Have you heard of him? And he says, yeah, that's right. But nonetheless, there has to be some other sort of mechanism. So this is, as he says, there has to be some other mechanism which can explain how DNA came to be through some kind of process of evolution. I don't know what it is, he says, but it has to be there. Okay, so fine. You can argue that way too. So therefore, but if we stay within the Darwinian framework, therefore one ought not to believe DNA came to be through undirected pre-organic processes, because the probability of that having occurred is so low as to be dismissible. I'm not certain Weinstein really has a plausible response to that. So summary, there is a first unmoved mover, first cause, a necessary being, a standard of perfection, and an intelligent designer of the whole cosmos. I think that's good enough for us. I have some other stuff from a different reading assignment I didn't give you, so I'm not going to bother with it. And we can stop there. Okay? So guys, be well, and I will see you Monday.